Hello, thank you. Thank you, excuse me, Mick and Neil for your presentations. We've had one or two questions, but some quotes. So I'll just, a couple of comments for a start. From Dave at the start said how frustrating it is how vegetation can seal gaps, but then when the tree rots and it starts causing leaks. And again from Dave about how sealing a liner is very difficult, which I think Mick covered one or two issues. Like I remember being on the Lancaster one while they were trying to seal those for a start, and it just kept raining on us and everything like that. So progress was very slow. Bernie sort of mentioned concrete as being very environmentally unfriendly. Did either of you want to make any comment on Bernie's comment about concrete?
I think it's just using it appropriately in the right place. It's as we very rarely do entire concrete reline sections now. We probably did 15, 20 years ago, but it's used as a material for certain lining systems, and we do use concrete protection to some of the plastic liners or the rubber liners, but it's all down to what we can get and what's the most appropriate material in the long term for that particular solution. So if it gives us 50, 100-year design life, then there is an offset in terms of the overall impact, environmental impact of the project.
Whoops, thank you. Questions are coming through thick and fast, but I will try now and keep up with them. Lindsay asked, is there a problem with using other materials to other than clay? No. Is there a problem with using other materials to clay of the leaking of chemicals into water?
There's a number of solutions. We use puddle clay quite extensively. So Mick made a comment earlier about the Buckingham Canal Society where they had leakage when they've rewatered. So in that instance, what we've historically do is we open up a slip trench. So we generally, it's a trenching bucket, sort of maximum 300 mil wide. So we open up a trench. We tend to go either side of the leak. So if we can pinpoint where the leak is, or if we know it's in the range, we'll go beyond that. And we'll excavate down till we find clay. So we know we're bounding onto the clay, and then we'll build it back up again. So it's a very effective material. It's obviously a natural material as well. But there are other options in terms of sealants. Bentonite pellets, it does work sometimes if it pulls into the leakage path. And we also use polyurethane grouts, which expand in contact with water, which they're relatively easy to install because it's very simple machinery, just a probe which is driven into the ground at an interval. So it's all hand driven. You drive the grout in using a grout pump, again, quite a small thing, but the grout itself is quite expensive. It's inert material, but it's quite expensive. Yep. Any thoughts on that, Mick, in terms of alternatives to clay?
Oh, as a leak sealing material, do you mean? I mean, clay is obviously the easiest and the cheapest first option. I suppose you could reduce leakage but not eliminate it completely with interlocking steel trench piles. But you might be able to steel clutches, but you greatly reduce leakage rates possibly by using steel trench sheets. There are, I've not used them myself, but there were developed sometime plastic trench sheets, but I don't know how effective they are at sealing leaks or jointing together. I've not used them myself. But I thought if Lindsay was asking the question about other materials leaching chemicals in the ground, into the ground other than clay. I think you'd need to find out what materials you were perhaps placing over a canal liner, and whether there was a potential for a chemical reaction with the water that you've got, or checking the water that you're actually using to refill the canal. Certainly investigation before you choose a particular liner would be money well spent.
Thank you. We're going back to a couple of concrete comments before we leave concrete. One comment from Dave is worth looking at low carbon concrete, which may become available in the future. And Roy says that it wasn't mentioned when describing concrete is the need for joints with water bars, and what joint spacing would be used.
That's something you'd have to look at as part of the design, to do with thermal expansion, and also how much you construct, because you may have to put a construction joint in. So it's very dependent on the actual design of the unit.
Nick, any comments on that, or is?
No, I just I agree with Neil. You would need to introduce expansion, contraction joints into the concrete, and they would have to be sealed both on both the front face, the wet side, and the reverse face. They'd have to be connected as well, using dowel bars to prevent movement between adjacent panels. But as Neil says, it would be very much dependent on the situation as to how often you would introduce a construction joint.
Thank you. We've then had a question come in via email from Bernie. Has Safari been proven sufficiently for IWA and CRT to recommend its use?
The conversations that I had with Shropshire Union Canal Society was that they're very happy with it. And I don't know whether it would really suit the situation as to whether Safari is the right material to use. Certainly, Shropshire Union are very happy with it. That's the impression I've got from them. They're carrying out water tests regularly with the material that they're laying, and they're not finding any leakage.
Yeah, I've spoken to colleagues who've been involved in lining schemes that have utilised it, following on from the restoration conference, and they've very much the same as Mick. I think there was problems in the early days, and I think they've changed the composition of the liner, in that the way it's constructed, which seemed to have been successful, and certainly where we've used it, we haven't had issues subsequently.
Thank you. Let me find the next one. Where is it? Chris, what grade of bentonite should be used? The supplier to the Derby Canal has 6 grades of bentonox, and other suppliers no doubt have multiple grades. Whilst CRT or IWA shouldn't be expected to state that type ABC from supplier XYZ should be used, it would be extremely helpful if CRT or IWA could specify the properties of what they deem to be a suitable grade of bentonite, particularly the hydraulic properties of flux, index, and permeability.
Well done.
Thank you. Thanks for that one, Chris.
Yeah, I know from experience that on the Wendover arm, they were using a particular grade of bentomat, and they got the supplier out to do some water sampling, and he recommended a different type, plastic bagged material. But the practicalities of laying that made it more difficult, and Wendover Canal reverted back to not the original, but a development on the original type of bentomat. I would have thought that your site investigations would suggest the chemicals that might be in your soil and what would be perhaps a best grade for it. Or it's probably, I don't know if the bentonite itself changes, but probably the different types of the geotextile that it's sandwiched between would perhaps influence your choice of grade.
I'd agree, Mick. I think the issue or the key to this is to get the suppliers involved at an early stage to help to recommend which one of their products is appropriate. And there are increasingly more companies supplying these materials now as well. And it is a case of finding the correct one for the correct site, really.
Thank you. So, what is the expected design life for each of the options if laid correctly?
Good question.
Yeah,
You've flummoxed us.
On our schemes, certainly, for instance, where we've used, if you say sort of the plastic pond type liners, we're working on for our schemes, we're working on 100-year design life with the protection they have. In theory, they shouldn't deteriorate once they're protected and in situ. It's if they're affected by another aspect. So, for instance, chemical degradation. But I would think certainly in situ, you'd be hoping to minimum of 50 years. But as I say, we're working on 100 on the schemes that we design. I think, again, you'd need to speak to the suppliers in terms of what, obviously they do testing to try and work out what degradations are and exposure to UV light, etc., but that they will be able to give you an indication for their particular product in that environment you're putting it into.
Ray says it was implied that interlocked steel trench sheets are waterproof. Is there not leakage through the clutches?
As we said, they're not completely watertight, but you would be able to reduce the rate of water leakage, I'm sure.
Yeah. We regularly use them, trench sheet piles as leak stopping, and you can put clutch sealants on, so you can apply sealant, but it's a bit like a set of stop planks. If you get leakage through it, it will pull fines through over time, and it will just rack up and seal. Depends on the manufacturer. So some of the clutches are tighter than others. So trench sheet piles, generally the clutches are quite tight. But yeah, it does depend on the clutch design. But we have used clutch sealants in some places where we've needed to produce a watertight seal.
Thank you. Ray, difficulty with getting clay to the right water content is perhaps to use a pug mill. Gullum, Hayder, thanks Roy. Gullum, Hayder of the BWB developed a specification for clay. Are either of you aware of that?
We've got a standard puddle clay specification, which is actually in part of our, it's published in our external work. So the third-party works code of practice, there's a puddle clay specification printed into that, published into that. So if anybody wants it, we can supply that. But I've not come across that particular piece of equipment that was mentioned.
Perhaps Roy would like to share it with us.
I'll wait for the answer. Chris says, do CRT have a preferred method to use? Are there any conditions to make sure a restored canal can ultimately be taken over by CRT? That one's yours, Neil.
Yeah. And Jodie might be able to confirm this from the Restoration Hub perspective, but with canals where there's a possibility the trust may take over maintenance or ownership in the future, we have agreed through the construction process and the restoration process the works that have been undertaken. So we've had a sort of engineering approval of that, and ultimately with marinas, there's a stilling test process to show that they're watertight. So again, we have done stilling tests on certain sections. Mick's familiar with this on the Wendover Arm, that we've been doing stilling tests to determine the leakage rates, and if that leakage rate is above what's deemed as an acceptable level, and again that's defined within the documentation for our marinas process, that would, we have to then consider whether there's remedial actions required before we could allow connection to the main network.
It's certainly from groups that I've spoken to. I'm thinking Lancaster, on the Montgomery Canal and Wendover Arm. There have been stillage tests carried out before the canal has been taken over. On Montgomery, I think Canal and River Trust actually take over the canal and carry out the stillage test themselves. So it is something that I think before Canal and River Trust would accept a canal, they would want to make sure that they're not taking over something that's going to be more of a problem to them than not.
Yeah, and I can just come in there. So if a canal is one that's not our land, and it's a canal that that we would be asked to be taken on, then we'd also obviously the risk and the cost of that. So we would look to kind of a long-term maintenance plan, and in kind of in some words almost kind of like a dowry for taking on that canal, so that it doesn't have a financial implication on the trust as a charity, and kind of looking at the financial implication of that, and some kind of handover package of a sum of money to take on that responsibility and liability of that canal.
If anybody has any further questions on the answers they've had, please do put them in the chat and I will get to them eventually. Next one, this one's more for Mick. There have been many different methods mentioned, and it is true that different situations require different solutions. Do the IWA have any statistics on price versus success, so as to have a hierarchy of possible solutions?
Well, the simple answer is that we don't. I deliberately avoided putting cost in or cost comparisons into the case studies, because every situation would be different. It's not only the material cost, but how you actually can go about installing the material and what plant and equipment you would need. It's perhaps something worth considering is to get some feedback from restoration groups that have been lining canals, and we perhaps get some idea of cost per linear meter of lining, and how effective they are, how easy they are to put in. Perhaps this webinar is a forum to open up that discussion, and then to have a greater exchange of information in the future. It's a case of restoration groups coming together, and in that respect, I could perhaps be the coordinator and take on that role of bringing together that information. So it's not something that we have at the moment, but it is something worth progressing, so that when we review the next books in the Practical Restoration Handbook, we can give a more considered guidance to other groups that are using it.
We've got 2 participants who've raised their hands. My technical know-how doesn't at the moment do that. Jodie, could you see if you could see who it is, and ask, or if they would like to just put a question at the bottom of the Q&A at the moment, then I can zoom down to that.
Hi, so I can just see one hand raised, and that's Lindsay's.
Right. Unfortunately, we can't open you, unmute you at the minute, Lindsay, without muting everybody else. If you just put it in the bottom of the chat, I mean the Q&A, I'll zoom down in a minute to that. Let me have a look. Right, Lindsay asks, does the overgrowth of vegetation affect the integrity of any of the linings?
It depends on the nature of the vegetation. Obviously, bigger wooded vegetation could potentially. Certainly, our experience is if there's a source of water, the roots will grow towards it. So when we're doing our schemes, we do tend to leave a margin, and we've had to do some offside, for instance, offside vegetation clearance to facilitate the installation of liners in the first place. The vegetative fringes we put in, so the ones we actually construct, tend to be reeds or grasses, so very, not sort of vegetation that's going to damage the liners. But yeah, tree roots could potentially be an issue, particularly if there's a leak. If you've got a very fine leak, there's the possibility that the roots will find that and then find their way through a small gap in the liner, and over time could cause an issue. But I have to say, I'm not aware of any on the relining schemes we've done.
Just coming in, thinking about it, I would have thought that the joints between rolls or whatever of the liner are potential for tree root ingrowth or ingress, and I think although the liners themselves might be self-healing if they're penetrated, you can't really protect the joints in the same way. The geotextiles are I'm not going to say are impervious to vegetation, but small roots that are growing through the bentonite or the acrylic polymer would probably seal around the root. It's probably more likely in natural materials like a clay, where a root growing through the clay, a true root growing through the clay, would act like a pipe and would pipe water out of the canal into the surrounding ground.
Picking Mick's point up there in terms of leakage through the clay, what we tend to find is all right when the trees are in good health, it's when they die back, and then the root system starts to die off, and then you're left with these gaps. Because with trees all the way along the canal, the reason obviously they're there is because there's a source, they can get the source of water from the canal. So there's lots of examples where they've grown through the liner, particularly on restoration schemes where the canal's been out of use for a long time. That allowing that to wet back up and seal back up is one of the challenges, and I think that's been one of the issues the Buckingham Canal Society have had is leakage through tree roots.
Thank you. Roy. Plastic trench sheets were trialled on the Grand Western. They broke on driving.
Yeah, there's some different designs. The original plastic piles look very much like trench sheets. And I know sort of 20 years ago, one of our waterway supervisors at the time bought a load because he thought they would be a brilliant idea. And I think they used them for roofing sheds in the end because they couldn't drive them into the ground. But the designs have changed now. So there's an H section, a series of 8 section piles they're like a cell. So you've got a rectangular pile with cross divides in it. which with a different piling head arrangement as well. But one of the concerns with plastic piles is microplastics, introducing plastics and potentially microplastics into the environment. So we have used them in certain locations. They do act as a watertight membrane because the actual connections are really good on them, depending on which profile you use. But yeah, the early ones were not very clever. They are much better now, and the Environment Agency I know have used them on some schemes recently.
Nick, did you want to comment on that one at all, or is Neil sufficiently answered, do you feel?
I think Neil has sufficiently answered for me.
Right, Dave, I believe Bentamat is also used for sealing hazardous waste tip sites.
Yeah, there are case studies on some of the websites. So if you look at the suppliers' websites, there are some case studies where it's been used to seal waste sites.
So would you recommend it as the sealing?
It would depend what was in your waste. You know, if it's not chemically compatible, then you're making just making an expensive problem.
Again, if you're thinking about doing that, I would recommend speaking to the suppliers of the particular product.
Thank you. Right, Chris, you mentioned a drainage pipe under the lining to prevent a liner rising when the canal is emptied of water. We have a 300-metre stretch already in place without a drain. What would you suggest should be done now?
It depends on the ground conditions you're working in. So if you're in a situation where water table and drainage adjacent aren't an issue, and in the section you're unlikely to dewater in the future, it's probably less of an issue. The places we've used it are on locations where we have concern about pressures under the liner. So we don't install it everywhere, but it's something to consider. And they don't even have to be an active drain. So we've got some where we've got the pipe is connected to a sump, so just a manhole in the towpath. And when we dewater it, we'll put a pump into that sump to draw any water away. So we're just mitigating the risk of anything rising. So I think, again, it depends on the situation. It may not be an issue in that particular location, but it is something to be considered really at design stages. Is there a risk that you could get a pressure below the liner? Especially, it's not, as I say, it's not normally an issue when the canal's in water. It's the future maintenance, if you like, and risk if we dewater.
Yeah, I think you'd at the design stage you'd need to make sure that the water table wasn't likely to affect your lining.
That comment, Mick, fits in a bit with what Dave has put. Would a drain pipe be necessary under a liner if the water table is below the canal bed?
If it's below the canal bed, that shouldn't be an issue. It would be if the water table was quite high. Let's just say quite high, above maybe if it was at the normal navigation level or close to that, so that at a time when the canal was dewatered, the earth pressure or the water pressure on the ground would actually cause the liner to float. I mean, it'd be just like the empty canal would be like a boat on a lake. It would just be buoyant, and the water pressure would tend to push it up.
One of the canals, particularly we've got drainage under, is on the Monmouthshire and Bracken. That's because it's on the side of the mountain, so we get drainage coming underneath the canal. So even where we've not got culverts per se that carrying the water, they can get a situation where you've got water naturally tracking underneath the bed of the canal. So if it's on sidelong ground, it might be something you want to consider as well, because there we know there is pressures, and we've actually got examples where we've dewatered the canal when the concrete lining and water's bubbling up through the bottom of the liner. So, and that's not necessarily groundwater. It's just because we do our works in the winter, and the winter's the wettest period. It's almost that double whammy in terms of something we just need to consider for the future.
Thank you. Dave has commented on the cost issue. Total cost per linear metre of a project is probably very different from the cost of the last pass of the project, as there's always a long learning curve, which future projects can hopefully benefit from. The techniques used by the Wendover arm have changed quite a lot over the years. I don't know if either of you want to comment on that, or whether it's more just a comment that's used.
I think it's a valid point that Dave's making, that restoration groups, when they start off on a project, whether it doesn't necessarily have to be a lining project, it can be any project. Until your volunteers get used to how they're working, there is going to be a learning curve. It's going to be slow to start, and then as they found out on the Wendover arm, they can adapt their methods to make it essentially they were using it to make it safer, to reduce some of the manual handling element of the lining system, because even a 5 metre by 4 metre panel of Bentamat, it's still a heavy piece of material that need probably 4 or 5 people to get it into position, along with an excavator. I'm not sure, I can't remember, I think a roll of Bentamat is in the order of tons, so it needs a decent piece of equipment to lift it. And even just at the start on Wendover, they were rolling out the Bentamat and cutting it. Even just that process of rolling it out and cutting it into lengths and re-rolling it was quite a manual handling issue. When you consider there are other manual handling issues that you can't get away from, such as laying solid concrete blocks over a liner, anything you can do to reduce reduce manual handling when you're rolling out the liner is going to be a benefit.
I'm just picking that up. One of the things on every one of our projects we have is a post-project appraisal, and picking up learning for future projects to feed in. And one of the items we're asked for in every project booklet we issue internally is other similar projects, to try and draw that learning in. So even using, our design teams and contractors that we work with for many years, we're still learning on schemes that we're feeding into the next one. And I think that's a natural progression, and something it's good that the Canal Societies are talking to one another, because one can learn from the other's experience.
Yeah, lessons to learn on this is, who's got the source, who's got the information, and who do the societies come to and ask, is there any history or anybody else done this, and what lessons have they learned? So yeah, it's probably worth just keeping that information available somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say that, certainly my experience, when a project's finished, everyone just wants to get off that and move on to the next one. And it is that project appraisal process that is often neglected. And I think for people to learn, we've got to share that information. And as I said, I'm quite happy to be the conduit for restoration groups to pass on information at the end of projects. And perhaps I should be a little bit proactive and just produce, or perhaps I could nick Canal and River Trust template for post-project appraisal form and pass it over and just see what response we get from people, because that was the intention of the Practical Restoration Handbook 20 odd years ago, was to bring together information so that restoration groups could share it, and they didn't have to reinvent the wheel every time they started a project. And there's a wealth of information out there, and let's just bring it together and share it.
Brilliant. Let's hope that begins from after today in a long, slow process. It's not going to be an overnight one, but
yeah.
Anthony, can you outline the methods of stillage testing? Is it possible for an amateur to do this?
Do you want me to answer that, Neil? Because I've been
yeah, you probably got the experience
with the testing at Wendover. What I did, rather than the way that the stillage test was carried out at Wendover, was a section of canal was relined, and at one end there was an earth dam that had been in place for several years while the liner was being carried out. At the other end of the canal section, timber stop planks were put into a structure to provide the dam at the other end, and the section was rewatered. The channel was filled up to a level and the inlet was blocked off so that the water level was just sitting there, and we just watched to see. We put a gauge board up and watched to see whether the level stayed, the water level stayed the same, or whether it reduced. Unfortunately, on Wendover, the water level reduced to an unacceptable level. There were different sections. One section was a purely trapezoidal section that was relined. Another section had a weir and sluice structure in it, and another section had a concrete mooring wall. So the benter mat had to be sealed against a concrete mooring wall. So in order to find, or to local or find where the leak is likely to be, the canal channel has been divided into 3 sections and is now being rewatered. Those 3 sections are now being rewatered to identify which section the water loss is most prevalent in. So you can do your own stillage test. One word of caution perhaps is, if you're doing a stillage test, you must allow for your natural materials to saturate. You can't just fill the channel up and then cut off the water supply. You need to leave the channel to saturate. Neil made a comment earlier about how channels naturally seal themselves up with silt and vegetation. So it might be you've got a low rate of leakage that over time will seal itself, and it's whether that time period is acceptable to whoever's going to be taking over and maintaining the canal in the future.
Thank you. Dave, on something you just said, Mick there had said earlier about sealing a liner to piling is very difficult. So
yeah, but that, as Neil pointed out in his talk, the materials that we use, or that can be used for lining, are very good. The weak point is always going to be the jointing system, either between adjacent panels of the liner or when you come up against a different structure. And that's where you've got to pay more attention when you're doing your lining work, is to pay attention to getting that right. That's where the highest risk is. So you've got to work hardest to make sure those are done right.
Yeah, on that, I know that when the canal was realigned above the Merry Hill Shopping Centre, it was piled, and then it's got a benter mat bed material in it, and the interface between the benter mat and the piling was the critical element to ensure the watertight seal. And it's something that took a few iterations to refine. And that's why it's those gas mixers, those connections are the bits that's why, you know, as I said earlier, when we reline, we try and tie into a bridge, for instance, so we've got something we know we can tie the relining into, rather than stopping in channel, because you can put a pile cut off with a concrete beam across the top and then tie the liner into that, but it's more complicated, it's a bit more fiddly. But those details are the critical bit to get right. And that's sometimes where the suppliers will be able to advise based on what's worked elsewhere and their experience of their products.
Thank you for that. Going back to the vegetation issue, we've got a couple of mentions of vegetation here. Lindsay says here, it's very important for vegetation control and to be controlled then. And Dave says, do we need to be careful what type of vegetation is allowed to grow on top of a liner?
Yeah. Yes, to both, I think. When our ecologists are specifying what we're putting in, it's, you know, they are mindful of the environment it's going into. And yes, maintaining the vegetation to the rear is a critical aspect. And that should come out of, if you like, one of the things with the project is when the project is closed or the restorations can, you know, you're getting to the being maintained or getting to the end of the restoration period, is having that future maintenance plan of how you're going to maintain it going onwards.
David, just got a follow-up query to the stillage tests. Is it better to install temporary dams more often so stillage tests can be done on shorter sections?
Well, like everything, there's going to be a compromise. The more temporary dams you put in, the more temporary dams you're going to have to take out when you complete the whole project. I think if you on Montgomery, they're putting in temporary dams and testing and then taking out the dams, I believe. They test the section and they take out the temporary dam so that they know that that section's waterproof, and then they will reline a section and then another temporary dam re-water. But I don't know that might well be the case. On Wendover, to my knowledge, the temporary earth dams have been put in the past, but again, they're going to have to be dredged out when the whole channel is reopened, and that will bring its own issues of dealing with an amount of spoil and the risk of damaging your lining by taking out those temporary dams.
Neil, have you got anything? Would you like to comment on that? Or
I get, as Mick said, I think there's pros and cons of both. Having stop plank isolation facilities is probably something to consider. So as Mick said, one of the things with the earth dams is removing them, and the risk, you know, got a dredger or a machine there that you could potentially catch your lining and damage it. So, you know, perhaps consideration of where you've got isolation facilities at your bridges or even intermediate structures where there's an opportunity to put a set of stop plank grooves in that, you know, they can then isolate at those points, and it's easy to then remove those. And if they're standardized, you can use the same planks at each one. So something that might be worth considering.
Yeah.
we've got another, it's sort of 20 to 12. We've got 3 questions or statements at the minute left. So if anybody else has got anything they want in quick, please do just add them on, and hopefully we might have time to get to them. Ian asks, are there any areas of research that you think we should investigate? There are funds available for innovation if we could identify what we need to do. Any universities supporting canal lining projects, ?
There aren't any that I'm aware of at the moment. It's a good question, actually, not something I previously thought about.
It's an interesting idea, isn't it, for some students to look at, but I don't know whether I mean, when I was at university, I know that was a long time ago, but we weren't really encouraged to look at restoration so much. I think it's just I'm not aware of any scholars, let's call them, any university lecturers that have got a particular interest in canal restoration. if they have, it would be good to meet them, and then we could perhaps develop with them areas where they might be able to get students to look out and do some research for us.
I mean, we currently have 2 industrial students in my team. I say 2. One's just started. The other one's leaving us in September, and we've got another starting in September. So I certainly can ask through their tutors if there's any interest, so we can ask the question of the universities we've got contacts with.
If anybody else has contacts within universities, it might be worth passing those contacts either on to Mick or Neil, and so they can have conversations with them about, especially as the new university years will be starting October or whenever they start. Sometimes worth getting that in. Let's start getting a few more younger people involved and interested in what's going on, if we can, through their studies. Thought, and it's just a thought. Thank you, Ian. Chris, if IWA are to compile a cost per metre, could the type and grade of liner be included? Would CRT be willing to share the type and grade of bentonite liners they have used over the last couple of years?
I think if any sort of post-project proposal where you're trying to learn from, we'd need as much detail as we can get, you know, the type of liner, how it was laid, why it was chosen, that sort of thing.
And in terms of it, I think most of the works we've done on lining has been in support. That type of lining has been in support of restorations or on third-party works. But yeah, any information we've got, I'm sure we'd be happy to share.
Thank you, boys. Just nipping back to the dams on the Wendover. On the Wendover Arm, the locations of the temporary dams were lined with solid concrete, not just blocks, so that the excavator would be able to remove the earth dams safely. The earth dams were covered with Bentomat too.
Yes, yeah. But I know the detail of the dams on the Wendover. They do use concrete over the in place of solid blocks to provide a seal. You have solid blocks down across the bed, concrete on the bed of the canal, so that when you're dredging the bottom out, you're not likely to damage the liner. So again, as we were saying, if you're going to put something in that you've got to remove later on, it's got to be designed with that intention in mind. And that is, you know, I put a different hat on now. I take my support officer hat on and put my health and safety hat on. That's what the CDM regulations are all about. It's about not only designing your project, but designing it for future maintenance and demolition. And that sort of information will find its way into the health and safety file for the project. I'll take that health and safety hat off now and carry on with technical support.
Somebody else has just commented as well. Would water-filled temporary dams reduce potential damage to the liner?
That's something that was looked at Wendover, not personally by me, but by the team there. I know other groups have experienced problems with water-filled dams in securing them if there's flowing water. And again, it's how you effect a seal against the sides of your canal, and whether you're going to get a watertight seal against the sides when you put the dam in. You know, if you're putting a dam in, you've got to make sure that it's going to be the right size and it isn't going to disappear down your canal once you start putting water against it.
I don't think we've ever used those particular dams, but I know they've been used on third-party works. And as Mick said, there have been issues with them rolling, and also depending on the profile of the canal, it's getting those edge seals. It's okay on the invert. And the other thing is vandalism. I've seen some pictures of kids using them as trampolines.
Health and safety issue there, Mick?
No, as long as they're wearing life jackets, it's okay.
That's where all the life jackets have gone. Ian has actually put that so his question about the university research, it's the sort of thing that he himself does. So maybe worth more contact with Ian and see what all his students are doing and whether we can link in something there, because Ian's up on Barnsley area, Elsica, up there, so it might be worth it a quick chat on with him later on things there. Dave says some sections of canal have a drainage ditch parallel at either side, which I assume lets the groundwater under the canal drain away, making sure that the canal liner is always working in the right direction.
Yeah, I think certainly on the canals that I'm familiar with, quite a lot of them had, particularly where there are embankments, had tow drains, which sort of seepage from the canal would run away to, but also drainage off the fields would allow. Still something we try and, where they're present, try and maintain, because the benefits of having them. Trouble is, a lot of them have been lost. They're not all on trust land and quite often have been ploughed in or filled over the years. But it's certainly beneficial if you've got the opportunity to design it in, to put a tow drain at the bottom of an embankment or the top of a cutting to route that water away from those earthworks.
Thank you. So that was the last question we've got at the moment on the question and answers. If anybody else has got anything quick they would like to just slip in there, or any comments, please do feel free. In the meantime, thank you, Mick and Neil, for your session today. It's been really useful and interesting, I'm sure, to a lot of the groups. Upcoming, if Jodie would like to just step in, upcoming in the next couple of months, we have some more webinars, but I can't remember what they are. Jodie might be able to help us with that one.
Yeah, so it's almost time to wrap up today's session today. So yeah, thanks again to Mick and Neil, and to you, Jenny, as well, for facilitating that Q&A. And thanks to everyone for sharing your thoughts and your questions and experiences with us. I don't think there's any questions that we haven't got around to answering, but if there is, then we will follow up. And I know that kind of when we did these during the lockdown, we put the recordings onto YouTube and then sent a link around. So I'm sure that that'll be the way that we deliver it again. So you'll be able to watch this back. And like Jenny said, we do have some more workshops coming up. So in September, we've got one delivered by Terry Cavender on the 5 dimensions of water, and that's available to book now. And also we've got another one coming up at the beginning of October, which will be following on the conversations that we started at the Restoration Conference in the other workshop around young trustees. So all of the information will be available on the Restoration Hub newsletter, and so hopefully you're all signed up for that. Also on the RWA and CRT websites, you can book through the links, but also on our Canal and River Trust Restoration Facebook group. So if you are not a member of the group, I will just pop the link in the comments. It's a really great way to ask any questions, but also like Mick and Neil were saying, it's a great way to share information. We see a lot of questions being asked saying, you know, does anybody have any advice with thinking of doing this? Has anybody done it? And it's a great resource for sharing those that knowledge and that best practice as well. So I will pop a link in. So thanks again. I'll just hand back over to Jenny, just in case there's been any other questions that have come through, and I'll just pop the link in the chat boxes now.
Yeah, thank you. No more questions come through. Just a thank you from one of our participants, and a few more thank yous coming through. So there you are. Mick, Neil, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. We'll leave it up a few minutes so you can pick up the link out of the chat for the Restoration Facebook group. But other than that, thank you very much for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.